All right, praising God this time for, among other things, the ability or the opportunity to understand. Let's call this chapter Rejected, as we've been saying recently, for reasons that hopefully will soon become apparent in this chapter, Hosea chapter 4, that begins with a contention or a controversy that God has with the people of Israel. Understanding that they have, in verse 2, become something that seems akin to lawless, where it's going to say they break all bounds and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, it's having the effects of basically depleting or deteriorating the living conditions in the land. Verse 3, verses 4 through 6 are going to go on to say that part of who's to blame are the priests and the prophets. So he's saying, don't contend with the people, because part of the problem he has is with that portion of the leadership, as he's going to go on to specifically use a relatively famous quote in verse 6, where he's going to say, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. Thus, the title, God is now holding all of them accountable, the priests and the people alike. Understanding that as he's going to go on to verse 7, he's going to shift to talk about the conditions of the effects, or at least some of the effects that the lack of knowledge has had in the land, understanding that the more he has given them, the more they have sinned, reminding me of some of the things that we saw back in Psalm 119, where it seems that if David is the author of Psalm 119, he also noticed, before I was afflicted, I went astray, something that we might all have in common, but God willing, self-discipline steps in to check it before it goes too far. And that's exactly what seems to have not happened here, as he is going to talk about the way that he is now, verse 9, going to repay them according to their sins, since they didn't really seem to put the brakes on their own randomness. I don't have a good term for it, but they were just going buck wild. Anyway, verse 10 is going to go on to say that as they pursued whatever it is they wanted, once again, that whole concept of knowledge is going to come back to play, because it's going to be hard to, as Jesus is going to say, serve two masters. He's going to say God and money, but it's going to be hard to really grow in wisdom while you're concentrating on foolishness and folly. And so it seems that as they are concentrating on whatever it is they want to do, wisdom and understanding has not been a part of that. And now they're just growing what seems to be dumber. And so he is going to go on to say that it's going to manifest itself in a few ways, one of which is they're so desperate to reject God that they're asking dumb things for advice. And he's going to say literally here, they're consulting a piece of wood, and they're in a spirit of spiritual whoredom, which is one of the reasons why their wisdom is just not where it should be. As he is going to go on to say in verse 14, he is not necessarily going to punish the sins of the daughters and their brides in verse 13, because the men are so faulty in the example that they are setting, particularly in, once again, the example of the way in which they have woven prostitution into their worship. And so verses 15 through the end of the chapter are going to go on to talk about the way that this is typical in Israel, but it doesn't seem like it's an explicit warning, but it may be a low-key warning to Judah for them not to miss the example that they're about to see in what's going to happen to Israel, even though historically, as we mentioned on Wednesday night, that's exactly what they're going to do. And they're going to actually become worse, as Ezekiel is going to say, maybe 100 or so years later. But right now, they have at least the opportunity to see the example that God is setting in Israel, understanding that he is describing them in verses 16 on to the end of the chapter as a stubborn heifer. Verse 17 saying those who aren't caught up in their sins really should just leave them alone and put distance between themselves and whatever is going on in Israel, because once again, of what is about to happen to Israel. Going on in verse 18 to remind us once again, it's not just the people, but as he mentioned before, it was the leadership in the form of the priest. Now he's going to say their rulers dearly love shame in verse 18 before closing in the end of the chapter, verse 19, to talk about the way that they have been wrapped up in a wind that is eventually going to lead, this is my paraphrase pointing forward historically, to their ultimate destruction. Understanding that the thing that caught my attention most was, as we said, the degree to which they have not simply grown more dim by happenstance. They rejected knowledge, and over time, they simply lost their ability to think, reminding me of times when I've seen people in desperate situations who, like the rest of us, they experience the pressure to say things that simply conform to the pattern of things that make good for their job security, but over time, saying the things that they're conditioned to say compromises their ability to actually think. If you've lived for very long, you know that pressure, but part of the reality that God seems to be trying to help us understand is that merely conforming comes at a cost. And it's one thing to conform because of the pressure to basically put food on the table and feed your family. But the book of Hosea seems to be describing a time in Israel's history where they were simply conforming to their own lusts. And over time, when they needed to think, they were no longer capable of thinking effectively.